My name is Dr. Sharifa Al-Adwani. I am an assistant professor of political science here at the AUK. I'm also the director for the Center for Group Studies. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I would just like to ask if everybody could turn off their mobiles or the sound on their mobiles, if you could turn that off. And if you have questions regarding the talk, if you could hold those for after the talk, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. For those here that are interested in receiving a stamp, we'll be giving stamps after the talk, and I can direct you all as to where that is. For now, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ms. Batul Sadliwala, who's a valedictorian of AUK, holds a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, which is located in Massachusetts. She studies conflict resolution and NGO management. A third-generation migrant, she is a local of Kuwait and graduated from here with a BA in our own department in International Relations in 2016. She has experience working in the nonprofit development sector in Kuwait and in Lebanon. Her research interests include Middle East migration policy, citizenship, conflict, and development. Findings from her work on Gulf migration and on the famine migration nexus has been recently published by the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. I myself have not had the pleasure of being able to have Batul in one of my classes because I came after she graduated, but what I do have the pleasure of is being taught by Batul today as she delivers her lecture. Please, everybody, welcome Ms. Batul Sadliwala to the stage.
Oops, very loud. Okay. Well, it is very surreal to be back in this room on this side of a CGS talk. So I'd like to thank the CGS Center for having me here, to thank Dr. Sharifa and Mohammed for helping put this together, my family for being here, and also, even though he's not in the room, my master's thesis faculty advisor, Professor Christopher Tanner at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Well, today what I'm going to present is work that emerged from my master's capstone at Tufts. But even though this was work that I conceptualized and wrote during my time in Boston over the last 2.5 years, a lot of the inspiration for this work, the seed of the idea, was in fact laid during my time here at AUK. And also through my work with civil society in the country. So big shout out to all my professors and colleagues as well. That said, the main philosophical aim, to put it, for the work that I do, for my research, is to challenge conventional narratives, both in scholarship and in the mainstream media and popular discourse about migrant experiences in the Arab Gulf, specifically Kuwait in this case, and about the connection between migration and socioeconomic development. Specifically, what I want to do is to contextualize the role of legal and political structures such as Kafala and ethnocracy in shaping migrant everyday interactions and also the lives of citizens as well. And in doing so, lay the foundation perhaps to see how this reconceptualized approach to Gulf societies can help us take a new approach to understanding the connection between migration and development. So without much further ado, I will try to speak for about an hour. I still remember how tedious lectures can be, I think, so we'll not lecture at you for too long. I'll begin first with an overview of my research question, discussing first the thought process that led up to the research question, then delve into the network approach, rather than the methodology that I use for my work, followed by a discussion of the case and specific observations, concluding with what are the broad implications of the research, and then open it up for Q&A. I've kept this presentation tailored to a more general audience on purpose, and so if you have any sort of more technical questions about the methodology or the theory, please feel free to bring them up during Q&A. So, the research question. Now, to begin, let's start. It's always a good practice to begin with a few figures and numbers to contextualize the problem, in other words. We're all sort of familiar. In Kuwait, we know that there's all this talk about the demographic imbalance. It's a problem, people say, in most of the region. 49% of GCC residents are non-citizens on Earth. This is the case in most GCC countries except Saudi Arabia and Oman, but even in these countries, non-citizens make up a significant portion of the population. In Kuwait, 57% of non-citizens are Southeast Asian or South Asian, 39% are other non-Arabs. But then these are numbers, again, that we often see in the newspapers, parliamentarians, civil society activists talking about these figures. The numbers that often, in the context of Kuwait, don't get talked about are like these. This is data from the Public Authority for Civil Information. There are, for example, over 150,000 students in Kuwait who are non-citizens. So these are children of non-citizen residents who go to school here, perhaps are born here, spend a large amount of their childhoods in this country. People like myself, for example. You also have a large number of homemakers, or it's a shame we characterize them as inactive part of the population, but women who support their families and contribute to the economy in non-remunerative ways through the work of caring for the household. There are significantly more non-citizen homemakers than there are citizen homemakers. Another figure to note of interest is that 17% of non-citizens in Kuwait today were actually born in this country. So, what does then the literature or the scholarship say about the experiences of this non-citizen population and their interactions with citizens and with the state? There are two conventional frames of analysis, and these are what today I will try to nuance, contextualize, and question. The conventional wisdom first relies on an understanding of Gulf societies as ethnocracies, or in other words, as societies where the nation is seen as natural or pure rather than a collection of individuals who share in a community based on an equal distribution of rights and duties. Scholars such as Annie Longwa, whose seminal work, published in the 1990s, was one of the first to clearly examine the relationship between migration, citizenship, and nation building in Kuwait, conceptualizes ethnocracy in the Gulf as being of a civic nature, wherein the purity of the nation is not a function of race, religion, or language, but rather of citizenship conceived of in terms of shared descent. This, in turn, this ethnocratic framework manifests itself in sort of real terms in for example, citizenship laws and migration policies, where the category of who is a citizen and who is not has been significantly narrowed and defined over the last half-century. The other related framework, whose operations and legalese we are all generally familiar with, is the Kafala system. Beyond its, shall we say, legal specifics and on-paper description of who has rights and who has responsibilities and what these are, theoretically, the Kafala system serves as a means to regulate the presence of all non-citizens in the Gulf and in Kuwait, in such a way that the question of integration does not even arise, because the system specifically positions non-citizens as temporary contractual workers, regardless of whether their stay is actually temporary. And therefore, in the scholarship as well, the question of whether non-citizens ever develop a sense of belonging to the country does not arise. Which leads me, for example, to the question of whether these two frames of analysis are enough. The work, for example, of Annie Lomba, whose ethnography, The Wall Built on Sand, is the go-to guide for getting your first glimpse at understanding how migration and society in Kuwait are structured. In her work, she does an amazing job of describing how everyday interactions of citizens, non-citizens with each other, just people, in turn give meaning and give importance to structures such as citizenship laws and the Kafala system. What her work fails to do, however, is to allow for the possibility that it is these same interactions and relationships that can, over time, transform the meaning of these systems and their application in the everyday. Similarly, somewhat more recent work by Andrew Gardner on the Indian community in Bahrain, for example, tends to look at, tends to first tell us that there's a difference in the lives of working class versus middle class Indians. But in the conclusion of his analysis, the reliance on ethnocracy and the Kafala system as central to the analysis leads to a conclusion, whereas the differences between these two classes of people are completely discounted, and in their placement vis-a-vis Bahraini citizens, for example, Gardner prefers an analysis where both these categories of Indians are one and the same, but in fact their experiences and everyday lives are very, very different. So fundamentally then, there are severe limitations to using these two broad overarching frameworks for understanding migrant experiences, but also understanding Gulf societies as a whole. Firstly, as I earlier hinted to, is that they obscure the intersection of ethnicity and class and gender. They tend to see state-society relations in the Gulf as determined in very legalistic and very structural, rigid, unchanging ways. Secondly, it also ignores the variability in lived experiences. Often the scholarship tends to study a subset of a particular identity group and then generalize to all others. Often the focus in most work tends to be on, and rightly so, on domestic workers and on low-income, skilled and semi-skilled construction workers. But often this analysis, rather than being limited to these communities, is then extrapolated to the condition of Indians, Sri Lankans, and Filipinos in a particular country as a whole. And finally, a third drawback, I think the key challenge of centering these two traditional frames of analysis in the literature in Gulf migration and also in a lot of the journalistic and human rights reporting is that it, I use the word here, reify, but it makes real categories that are in fact exist on paper but operate very differently in practice. It takes the dichotomy that exists on paper between the citizen and the non-citizen, between the domestic worker and the kafil, between the construction worker and his or her manager, and assumes that the way that the relationship is described in a legal contract is how it actually operates. So then, if these are the shortcomings of the literature on the Gulf, what should we really be studying? As has been pointed out by scholars such as Neha Vora, an anthropologist at Lafayette College, who has done some excellent work on the Indian community in Dubai, as well as Natalie Cook, her colleague at Syracuse University, The focus rather should be on an analysis of differential inclusion. If Kafala and Ethnocracy comprise together a framework of the politics of exclusion, of how people in the Gulf are excluded from rights, from power, from a sense of belonging, the focus today in scholarship of the Gulf, and even in policy making and in practice, needs to be on looking at how instead, through our everyday interactions and our everyday social relationships in places like a university, at a workplace, in the marketplace, in the urban street, how do these interactions in fact amount to the ways in which we reshape our societies, our identities, and our place in them? It's this thinking that has in fact led me to my two very specific research questions. The first is, how do employees' nationalities and should be in here and class backgrounds affect the way that they form relationships with each other in the workplace and the nature of these relationships? To what extent are relationships determined by these structural forces that are somehow positioned as being out of our control, forces like the Kafala system and the inequalities involved in there, versus being shaped by the more mundane and micro-level particularities of things as simple as how an office is laid out, or who's sitting next to you, or who goes to the same church as you, or has the same interests as yourself. You might ask me here at this point why there's sudden focus on the workplace. So a couple of points on that note. Firstly, the workplace is where many of us spend the majority of our lives. 82% of Kuwait's workforce is employed in the private sector. 95% of this workforce is comprised of non-citizens of various nationalities, whereas most citizens, as we know, are employed in the public sector. So therefore, the private sector workplace is technically, in aggregate terms, a much more diverse place. And it's a place that has unfortunately not been studied from a sociological lens as workplaces in other parts of the world. Much of the literature on the workplace in the Gulf tends to focus on sort of conventional concerns of organizational productivity and employer-employee relations. When we do focus on ethnic diversity in the workplace, the focus tends to be primarily on expatriate adjustment to cultural differences, their morale levels, or alternatively on some of the difference in competencies between local versus foreign workers. There's really no work that looks at how people of different national and ethnic backgrounds actually work together and what's the resultant outcome of the interaction. And second, then also, the workplace is not only a place of work. It's not all about the next report or how much you earn. Literature in the field of workplace sociology shows that workplaces are in fact spaces where people can develop meaningful relationships of mentorship, friendship, and even romance. These are spaces that are not disconnected from other parts of a person's lives. People carry their emotions, beliefs, and values from their home to their office, to their place of worship, to the marketplace, to the government office. And when they do this, it means the decisions that they make in their office in relation to their work cannot be understood through a single one-dimensional analysis of workplace routines and objectives. On the flip side, a corollary of this is that a lot of study of social movements and social change often tends to focus on activism and advocacy and protest rallies and such. Whereas, in fact, you could learn a lot about social movement and social change through the study of these mundane sort of very specific spaces and interactions that you normally would not consider to be part of a movement, and see how social norms and attitudes are shaped therein. Which I think just capsulates my third point, is that the workplace is not isolated. It's situated within a network of relationships. So for example, in the case of the company that I surveyed, so they're a trading and contracting company, the relationships of their employees are not specific to the social world of their office and their construction sites, but are inextricably linked to the wider social structures of Kuwaiti society, talking about things like kafala, ethnocracy, the economy and such, but also to these, their employees' individual familial homes and their separate spaces there, as well as being linked to a more transnational network of the private industry and the construction industry. Talking about linkages, this brings me to my methodology. For this work, I decided to apply social network analysis, both as a methodological tool with various advantages, as well as a theoretical twist to the conventional literature. First off, to those unfamiliar, what is social network analysis? Sounds fancy, but very simply, it's a way to understand social systems that shifts our view away from the objects, away from individuals and structures to the relations between actors. The system in question can be anything. Can be a country, can be a government, can be a university, a workplace, or can be a terrorist organization, you name it. The actors in question can be individuals, such as myself or you, but it can also be groups of actors. You can have a network that connects different companies or different countries. The flows and the relationships that you measure between these actors can, again, be as diverse. You can study interactions and exchanges of trade, values, beliefs, information, disease, policy preferences. It's really very diverse. The opportunities are endless. Suddenly, I'm very loud. In the field of migration, a lot of this work, a lot of network analysis has focused on studying the flow of remittances, on studying migration routes and patterns, resettlement patterns, but really this methodology has not been applied to studying migration in the Gulf as yet. In terms of the benefits of this methodology, it is a good way to show the difference between what is versus what should be. For example, on the slide here, which I graciously borrowed from my advisor, is on the left-hand side, you can see a traditional organization chart that shows what the reporting structure should be like in an organization. All the names are false here. And on the right, you have a network map that shows us how communication actually occurs. So you have Vice President J, who technically should be informed of everything that happens in the organization. However, if you look at how communications actually work on the right-hand side, you can see that he is somewhere at the periphery of the organizational communication structure. On the other hand, there's this other interesting character, Cole, who, despite being somewhere at the bottom of the organizational hierarchy, shown here, is actually quite central to the flow of communications. So, as you can see, it's a really good way to show versus, this is how things actually should be, but that's how things actually work. So it's a really good diagnostic tool to map out relationships as they actually exist. Another benefit of network analysis is that it helps us organize and visualize data to analyze networks. Thanks to the miracle of technology, network analysis software today can help us organize large amounts of network data and create these wonderful maps so that we can, visually analyze what are the strands of a network, how does communication flow, who's influencing policy, etc. That said, however, the method is not perfect. A couple of limitations include that, of course, it's only one of many organizational assessment tools out there. It provides a particular kind of analysis that you have to complement with other methods. It provides only one network, usually provides information at one point in time, and only about one specific network or kind of relationship. So those, you've got to keep those shortcomings in mind. But then beyond the method, as I mentioned, network analysis was an easy choice to make for my study, also because of its theoretical advantages and its linkage to the field of relational sociology. Now, contrary to what we're told in IR research methods, or any social science methods class, research methods class, anywhere, where we tend to focus units of analysis as being individuals or collectives of individuals, like nations, the region, the international system, etc. A relational approach tends to shun that kind of substantive understanding of what is the main subject of social science study, and instead argues that it is relationships and the interactions between these substances that are the irreducible and the fundamental units of analysis. A lot of this work is built on the work of Mustafa Emre Bayar, Jeff Goodwin, and more recently Nick Crossley, who really lay out this methodology. It's what is called an anti-categorical imperative. So rather than studying a person's individual ethnicity or a culture's understanding of religion, for example, this method, a relational approach, would tend to look at how is culture and ethnicity defined in relation to another culture or another individual, for example. In doing so, this method, this approach, overcomes somewhat a very basic challenge that we face in most social science research, not just in study of Gulf societies. The structure, there's the difference between analyzing the individual versus the structure, individualist versus holist approaches. Holist approaches, to put it simply, is when we see society as being larger than the sum of its individual parts. So therefore, in a lot of the Gulf migration literature, for example, even when ethnographers tend to highlight the different experiences of their individual interlocutors, the conclusions then tend to be generalized at a structural and social level. On the flip side, individualist approaches are much more naive. They tend to see society as nothing more than the actions and beliefs and behaviors of individual actors. From a relational approach, however, overcomes this because it does not infer the relationship, the nature of the relationship based on structures and identities. So rather than saying that, okay, here's a Kafala system, here's how relationships between citizens and non-citizens are laid out in the system, and therefore this is how we expect people to interact. Rather than saying this, a relational approach first looks at the nature of relationships itself, and then attempts to make any claims about the existence of structures and what these structures are. Of course, these networks of relations work together with conventions, such as norms, explicit and implicit, policy preferences, legal systems, etc., along with the distribution of resources, whether tangible, such as wealth, or intangible, such as power, to make up social worlds, such as universities, governments, countries, people's households, which are, again, themselves interconnected. In terms of, for the purposes of this lecture and for the purpose of my research, The approach really reshapes the understanding of how we see the kafala system and ethnocracy in shaping everyday lives. In this case, these two frames, the politics of exclusion, become not the overriding and absolute forces that shape the everyday activities and interactions of everyone across time and space in the Gulf. Their presence becomes much more contextualized to the specifics of a particular context and its particular social and organizational realities. Which I think is about time I got to my case, and this demonstrates this fact very clearly. So, switching tracks for a bit, the case I work with is that of Sadir Trading and Contracting Company, which is a Kuwaiti construction company. It's a small organization, relatively speaking, around 100 employees. And established in 1973, I will not go into too much detail about them. They specialize in interior finishing. Now, in terms of the firm's organization, it's laid out in terms of a lot of the project work is management project teams consisting of project manager, engineers, architects, designers, etc. And a lot of the administration then is handled by people who work on human resources, accounting, finance, all of it overseen by the general manager and his deputy. But that again is the organization chart. How things work in practice is a little different. Now, to conduct my analysis of interactions between employees in Sadir Trading Contracting Company, I first designed an online survey which was disseminated through the firm, to the firm's employees by email. The survey collected some basic attribute data, so things like people's age, their nationality, the number of years they've worked with the company, their role, how long they lived in Kuwait, things like that, along with, more interestingly, information on 4 networks, or 4 types of interactions. The first is the first network measured communication. This is professional communication. So employees were asked to respond to the question, who are the 3 to 5 individuals in your firm that you communicate or speak to most often about work-related issues? The second network was on collaboration. So this measured how people actually have to work together. So who are the 3 to 5 people that you really have to work with? Third network measured socialization. In other words, people were asked to name the individuals at the firm with whom they met on a non-professional basis, whether it was just going out for lunch, meeting each other's families over festivals, etc. Who were their friends, in other words. And the last network was a measure of aspirational collaboration. So this network asked individuals if they had the complete freedom to choose their project team, who are 3 to 5 individuals that they would like from their company to have. The survey received a total of 26 usable responses, and because it was what we call an unbounded survey, which means that the people who responded to the survey could then name other individuals in the company who may or may not have taken the survey. The complete network consists of 91 individuals, 91 unique Sadir employees, not necessarily all of their employees, and the number of relationships across these 4 networks, these 91 individuals are connected by 507 different types of interactions across the 4 networks. For a sort of clearer view of the representativeness sample, here we have these 2 pie charts. On the left is a breakdown by nationality of the respondents. So the 29 respondents, but 3 of the responses were not usable, so 26. Those respondents and the complete network. A lot of the employees you can see are Indians. You have a good number of Syrians, Egyptians, and Filipinos. A few people of other nationalities, and Kuwaitis as well. It's interesting to note, among the respondents, over half, around 17 have been in Kuwait for over 10 years. Around 90% have been in the country for 5 years or more. And many of them are in the country with their families as well. But again, this is the mundane bit. What do they know about the relationships between these people? So there are two ways to analyze network data. And here I may get a little technical, so again, bring up questions in the Q&A. Network data can, to put it simply, be analyzed at the level of the network itself, or at the level of an individual's relationships. At the network level, a lot of the data that I have isn't very helpful, to put it frankly, because it reflects a little bit more than the way that the survey went out. So you have this, what I call a core periphery structure on the diagram that you can see here. You can see that in red we have the respondents, those who completed the survey. They form this core network of actors, and then they are pointing to people they communicate with on the periphery, but then those individuals didn't take the survey. So this reflects only, rather than reflecting anything about how communication works, it tells me only how the survey went out. And this is the case with not only the communication network, but with all three other networks as well. So in this case, some of the more technical analyses that focus on network level cohesion weren't particularly helpful, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. More interestingly, however, there are two fundamental observations that I can make from my data. And while these may seem very banal and obvious at first glance, from a relational viewpoint, they are profound for the Berkeley Gulf Scholarship. The first, which more from a substantive than relational viewpoint actually, is that ethnicity and class do not overlap. In other words, interactions among CGS employees of all kinds defy expectations of the South Asian clerk and the Arab manager. In this diagram here you can see a diagram of all four types of interactions across employees laid by class. I've used a person's position in the firm's hierarchy as a proxy for class, although this is not a perfect measure. You can see here that people who form the top level of the firm's organizations have significant interactions of all kinds with people in mid and lower levels of the organization as well. The reason that this chart shows 296 ties instead of 507, if anyone's curious, is that the software that I use in fact counts when joining different networks, will count common interactions across those networks as one. So for example, if myself and Dr. Sharif have a collaboration tie, but we also socialize outside work, it's counted as one tie and not two. What this basically shows, though, from a more fundamental point, is that in studying Gulf societies, or in studying any space of social interaction in the region, one cannot assume the centrality of ethnicity and class-based segregations, or citizenship and class-based segregation. A central focus on Kafala and ethnocracy as main frames of analysis will lead you to this hypothesis. And if that's what you focus on, you will either have a hypothesis that is proven wrong outright, or a researcher will be led to conclude that the case itself is anomalous and therefore not representative of society as a whole, which is an odd conclusion to arrive at, because as we just discussed, the social world of the workplace or any place is never isolated from the wider social context within which it exists. A more fundamental observation is then that ethnicity and class-based fault lines as well do not determine relationships between different actors. As you can see here in this diagram, I've you've got individuals, the entire network arranged by class, again using a person's position in the organizational hierarchy as a proxy. Professional interactions, perhaps a little unsurprisingly, tend to flow across class lines. Unsurprising because to get work done, yes, you've got to work across all parts of an organization. More interestingly, however, you have a very similar diagram when you look at socialization in the organization. That is, who do people meet and interact with in an informal, non-professional manner? In this diagram, what you see is that interactions across class is, you can see a lot of social interaction between the mid and top level of the organization, the mid and lower level of the organizations. Now, keeping in mind again that this reflects only a very narrow snapshot of these individuals' non-professional social lives, and we don't know anything about how they interact outside the work, or who they interact with outside the workplace, it does give us 2 points to keep in mind. Firstly, it cautions us against assuming class-based homogeneity in people's social circles. It does exist, but don't assume it. You've got to look for it first. Secondly, it also warns us against assuming a clear-cut distinction between a person's work life and their non-work life as well. The same analysis, in fact, applies when I switch out class with ethnicity, or both looking at the interactions between Arabs and non-Arabs, or if I divide out the variables to include just focus on the nationalities as well. All 4 networks, whether professional or focused on socialization, show that Sadir's employees are engaged in everyday interactions with individuals of varying backgrounds in their day-to-day lives. This point is actually made more clear on an analysis of individuals' ego networks. That is, the analysis of relationships of particular individuals. Me here. So, meet Afzal. Again, using a false name to maintain personal confidentiality here. Afzal is in his mid-20s. He's a mid-level employee, Indian. He's been in the country for around 4 to 6 years, lives here with his family. What his social network reveals is that, professionally speaking, he's very collaborative. He is he collaborates with individuals from across the firm's hierarchy by running very technical and sort of, running a few mathematical measures. We also know that he is someone who is a good communication connector across the organization. So if information about a particular project needs to go from one end of the organization to another, he's a good person to speak to. However, when it comes to a social network, the organization is much more sparse, doesn't socialize quite as much. But again, analysis of his position within the socialization network shows that Afzal is, in technical terms, is called a boundary spanner. As in, while he doesn't have a lot of connections, if someone wants to make a social connection with someone else in the organization, someone they don't know, Afzal is perhaps a good person to first speak to. And then lastly, we also see in the aspirational network, Afzal is actually one of the few individuals who a lot of other people want to work with. He had the highest number of incoming aspirational collaboration ties, meaning a lot of people said that they would like to have this guy on their team if they could pick their own project team. Overall, what we see with, in the case of Afzal is that even though his network is dominated by Indians, as we can see in all 3 of these diagrams, his relationships cut across, reaffirming the first observation, class and ethnicity lines. Similarly, you see this in the case of Rashid as well. Rashid is a citizen. He's He's been at the company for a long time. He's at the top level of the firm's management. His interactions tend to be much more focused on the top and mid-level of the organization, perhaps unsurprisingly. In terms of collaboration, he is very important in terms of to getting work done at Sadir. A lot of project coordination, a lot of communication flows directly through him. When it comes to socialization, however, we see that his social relationships are much more centered around people from his own so-called class background, more in the top level of the firm's management. But again, not confined to a particular nationality, but particular region, you could say. And perhaps oddly enough, again, keeping in mind the limitations of the data, in terms of the aspirational collaboration network on the bottom right-hand corner, only one individual amongst the 26 respondents said that they would like to have him on their team if they could pick their own team. But again, keep in mind, this is limited data. Even so, what these networks demonstrate overall is that the social world of life at Kuwait, is shaped is not as clear-cut as one would assume. It's not just about the Arabs versus the non-Arabs. It's not about the few Kuwaitis wielding all the power in the organization. There is much more nuance to people's everyday interactions. And these interactions are also not all about work. They are also about getting to know people on a personal level. So, what are the big level implications of this data? I think, first off, before delving into that, a couple of caveats about my work. Firstly, this has really been an exploratory and a pilot study. My analysis would be much more rich if I'd been able to complement it with ethnographic interviews or on-site observations. Also, the data, again, remember, the response rate in the survey is roughly 25%. The networks here represent the state of interactions and relations at a particular point of time. The survey was conducted in the latter half of 2017. It's nice to have network data to compare across different time periods. And also, again, keep in mind that we don't know much about these individuals' lives outside their workplace at this point. That said, what these findings do show is that it is possible to study Gulf societies and various components of Gulf societies without placing ethnocracy and the Kafala system at the center of the analysis. In the case of Sadir, far from being excluded from the social world that they exist in, far from being excluded in the way the firm operates and how its rules are structured, the interactions between Sadir's employees clearly show that these individuals, through their actions and behaviors, are very much a part of making the social world in which they exist. And at least that's true in this particular case. There are, of course, constraints of class ethnicity, but they aren't as absolute and overriding as a lot of the conventional writing on Gulf migration tends to assume. More fundamentally, I think, just going back to analysis of differential inclusion, the analysis really leads us to question if relationships are centered at the fundamental need of analysis, how can our identities of class, ethnicity, national belonging, how are these reshaped and refashioned through these everyday interactions? I'm not saying by any means that the analysis of the Kafala system or ethnocracy and how the discriminatory impacts that these systems have are immaterial. That is not what I'm saying. Rather, what I'm saying is that the structural positions that these place individuals in are far from being as rigid and as unchanging over time as we often assume. The identities of a Syrian foreman and a perhaps more well-to-do Indian engineer are fixed and unchanging only to the extent that this is mentioned on official government and corporate paper. In the real world, on the ground, every day, the content of these identities and these relationships is constantly being performed and renegotiated by these individuals, who, in doing so, through minute ways over time, can change the meaning that they give, to change the meaning that they hold to their own identities, as well as to larger structures. Because really, beyond our citizenship papers, and given the historical migratory pull of the region, what makes a Kuwaiti a Kuwaiti? What makes an Indian an Indian? What are the ways in which Sadir's employees define their Indianness, their Syrianness, their Egyptianness vis-a-vis each other every day? The more fundamental question that for me was raised through my work, and which, of course, work doesn't answer yet, is how are individuals' subjectivities of belonging and citizenship shaped through their everyday professional and social interactions? From a more practical standpoint, the network approach, I think, also offers opportunities for scholars to expand ethnographic and anthropological understanding of Gulf societies, and to policymakers in government, as well as to people as well as civil society in the country. There are some practical applications of the network approach itself, and the sort of rethought understanding of what migrant experiences and residence experiences in the Gulf are. For government, for example, using a network approach is one of many ways to study perhaps the social, cultural, and economic contributions that the non-citizen population makes to the country's economy and to its social cultural development, and to clearly gauge out the costs and limitations of policies that seek a reduction in migration numbers for development purposes. Because after all, how can any country have an effective development policy when 2/3 of the population has been sidelined in it? For civil society, thankfully in Kuwait, we are blessed with organization, despite restrictions, we are blessed with a number of really active, vibrant, engaged, enthusiastic activists, non-profit organizations doing some really wonderful work on the rights of women, on the rights of migrants, the environment, etc. On the rights of migrants especially, though, a lot of the discourse tends to be focused on human rights in the narrative, in the engagement with the state and the general public. And while this is essential, these initiatives often don't involve equal leadership of citizen and non-citizen organizers alike, sometimes for obvious reasons. But even so, I think from a network approach, you can identify ways to make programming more effective by identifying opportunities for joint action, as well as opportunities to make linkages across issue areas, connecting the issue of non-citizens' rights and migrants' rights with those of gender, corruption, and the environment, and therefore really bringing residents of all nationalities into the fold as participants and contributors to a broader Kuwaiti society. So, that is that. I'd like to open up for Q&A now.
Presentation. Unfortunately, we're going to kick off the Q&A right now, but since I have the microphone first, I'd like to ask a question, if that's all right.
Of course.
but also across the Gulf?
Yes, certainly. I think doing this work in Kuwait was, I'd say, convenient. Because I grew up here, it's very easy to sort of complete the work in the constraints of my master's thesis. But certainly this approach can be replicated and should be replicated in other parts of the Gulf as well, and to really bring out, because again, a lot of the Gulf, people think that Kuwait is the same as the Emirates, is the same as Saudi Arabia, unless you've actually lived in these countries. So we know that these countries are very different, social dynamics are very different, and so definitely it would be wonderful to sort of replicate this work elsewhere.
Hello, hi. I know you didn't go into much detail about the policies, but I was wondering if you incorporated the 2035 vision of a Kuwait and their nationalization policy. You mentioned that migrants in Kuwait feel somewhat rejected from society, so these sort of discriminatory policies do compound that feeling. So have you incorporated that into your research, since it's kind of recent?
Thank you. It's a good question. I think it's not, that point isn't as much incorporated into the network analysis as such, but it was definitely something that's been food for thought for me. The development policy does, yes, focus on nationalization, which we know historically has been a policy that hasn't got anywhere much. Nationalization policies in the Gulf have been a key focus or pillar of development approaches here since the 80s and 90s. They haven't done much, so I really think now is the time, given the vibrant discourse around migration and in the region, I think, in the world actually, this is now the time to rethink whether this is the right approach. I wouldn't say migrants, I think, again, the question of exclusion is one that needs to be reframed. Yes, people feel excluded and discriminated against. That is a reality. But it is also true that these people are actively part of Kuwait's society, that they contribute in dynamic ways to the country's development. And this is something that should be capitalized on rather than shoved under the rug.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Batul, for your beautiful talk, and many of us here are very proud of you. And I just have a small question. How do you assess in your network analysis the quality of the interactions? How do you know if there's a sort of an aspect of dominant subordination in those interactions? Are they on equal playing fields when they interact? Or?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Professor. That's actually a limitation of the study. There is, given the time constraints of this and the resources, there wasn't time. If I was able to do, again, an ethnographic, take a more, conduct interviews, do on-site observations, I think I would have had much more rich data to really inquire into the content of these relationships, socialization, for example, who's the person who's really driving social activity, in collaboration network, for example, like who's really making decisions, for example. I think, frankly speaking, that is information that at this time I do not have.
Right, I'd like to very much thank Batul. I think there are a lot of people here that want to informally speak with Batul and take some of her time as well. So I very much appreciate what you presented here today. I think we all appreciate it, and I hope some of you all here as students follow in her footsteps, and we would be very proud to also host you all one day in the future. But for now, let's thank Batul for her wonderful, wonderful presentation. If you would like to receive your stamps, that's in the back, and our email list is, I think, on the table with the cookies.